You're listening to The Collected Podcast, bringing you stories that remind us who God is and who we are in Him. The Collected Podcast is a production of Collected Ministries. Follow Collected on social media at Collected Podcast, and be sure to visit thecollectedpodcast.com for show notes and additional content related to today's episode.
Welcome to Season 8, Episode 21 of the Collected Podcast. I'm your host, Jess French, and this week it's just me for our grand finale of Season 8. I can't believe that we are already in May, headed into summer vacation, and I'm feeling the need for a sabbatical again and some much needed time to just pray and gather my thoughts and prepare some messages to launch again in the fall and book new guests. But before I share what is on my heart today, I do want to let you know I spent some time looking back over Season 8, and I was just filled with gratitude and so humbled by the amazing guests that have been on and gave their time and shared their wisdom and their heart for the Lord with all of us. It is just such a gift. And I'm also so thankful for the different words that I feel like God has laid on my heart to share with you. And I'm so grateful beyond words for you listeners who tune in, whether you listen every other Thursday or maybe you drop in once or twice a year. And whenever you do, whenever God brings this podcast to your mind, I hope that in listening, you receive some sort of word of encouragement or truth or just a reminder of the character of God, the reminder of who He is and who we are in Him, and that it encourages you to walk boldly in your faith and walk with confidence and claiming the authority and the power of Jesus that you have in you because of what He did. I feel like that was a constant theme that ran through so many of our messages and the episodes in Season 8. And so we're going to end on that again as we wrap up this season. And so I want to actually revisit a short message that I shared back in Season 5. And as I was praying about what to do for this final episode, I had been reading in Mark, and Mark 6 stood out to me. I was kind of stuck there reading through that. I'm like, okay, wait, this sounds really familiar. I mean, I'd read it before, but I'm like, I think I've taught on this before. Sure enough, I did in Season 5. But I feel like the Lord gave me a lot of fresh insight and kind of a new look at it. So I wanted to revisit this. And so some of this is the same. There's some key points that I pulled from my old show notes, but there's also a whole fresh take on it that you'll hear. So, I mean, I'm imagining you don't remember if you have been with me since Season 5, I didn't even really remember I taught on it. So hopefully it all sounds fresh to you, even if you did listen back then, because it's been like over 3 years. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're digging in today to Mark 6, verses 45 through 56. And this is when Jesus walks on water after feeding the 5,000. So we're going to start by reading this passage, and then we'll break it down, and we're going to actually jump all over the early chapters of Mark today. So stick with me. I promise there's a through line, and it will all make sense, even though we're hopping around a little bit. So here we go, Mark 6, 45 through 56. Immediately after this, Jesus made His disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of Him to Bethsaida. When He dismissed the crowd, after leaving them, He went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake and He was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, He went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw Him walking on the lake, they thought He was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw Him and were terrified. Immediately He spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then He climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed in Gennesaret and anchored there. as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. Okay, let's break it down verse by verse and see what we can glean from the story again about the character of Jesus. So verse 45 starts out immediately after this. So my first question is, after what? Well, Jesus had just fed 5,000 people with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The disciples had just witnessed a miracle, and yet many commentaries that I read tend to believe that the disciples didn't recognize that miracle, that it had even taken place. There is a notable absence of admiration at the end of the passage in Mark 6:30 through 44, which gives an account of that story. We also read in Mark 6, verse 52, that I just read a moment ago, that they did not understand the loaves because their hearts were hardened. So right from the get-go, we can read this story with the understanding that the disciples did not yet have an accurate view of who Jesus was and what he was going to do. And I find this particularly interesting because the disciples had just returned from their own successful missionary journeys, where Jesus sent them out into pairs to teach, perform miracles, and heal people in his name. Mark 6:30 through 34 tells us, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them, he there being Jesus, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. Then this would go on to talk about, then they realize they're hungry, there's no food, and he turns 5 loaves and 2 fish into plenty of food with remaining left over after he fed 5,000. So the disciples here in the beginning, we see that they had finally made it back to Jesus after these missionary journeys that they went on. And they were most likely craving rest, food, and quality time with their teacher. And throughout his whole life, we see Jesus always recognizing the importance of rest. Yet here, when he saw the crowd that had gathered, Jesus had compassion on the crowd and began to teach them. The Bible isn't completely clear on the thoughts and feelings of the disciples here, but I imagine that they felt put out or inconvenienced by the crowds. They wanted rest. Maybe they were hangry, and they saw these crowds, waiting for their arrival as more work to be done. And they feel like, you know what? No, I have earned a rest. I've worked hard. I work all the time. They needed some food and they needed a little nap. David Guzik explains in the Enduring Word commentary, the disciples often saw the crowds as work and as constant demands, especially at a time like this when their well-deserved rest was interrupted by the multitude. But Jesus saw them and was moved with compassion. Each face reflected a need, a hunger, or a hurt. Being a thoroughly others-centered person, Jesus cared more about the needs of someone else than he cared about his own needs. So I wonder then if the disciples missed the miracle because they were sulking about losing the rest that they believed they were entitled to after so much hard work traveling and teaching. And yet Jesus is modeling the opposite of that these lost souls who are searching and hungry for the word of truth, that they trump our need for a nap. And this, thinking this, kind of carrying this thought process through, I was immediately followed in my mind by a gentle, tug of conviction, because how often have I been guilty of the same thing? I know that there have been many times in my life, especially in the classroom or in, the school setting where I have felt entitled to one thing, like my planning period, entitled to one thing or another, but it turned out that God had a different plan, and maybe a meeting is scheduled or a student needs me or I have to cover a class. And, these are just small examples, but it's each of those little moments when I had a plan for maybe a little break or to catch up on something I needed to do, and yet somebody else needs my attention in that moment. And what am I going to choose to do in response to that? And so here for the disciples, and so many times in our lives, we feel like we're entitled to one thing, but it turns out that God has a different plan. And a God-ordained inconvenience, quote unquote, might have been the very thing that he is trying to use in our lives to reveal his glory and maybe even work a miracle like he literally did here with the disciples. So my prayer for us today in relation to this little part of the teaching is that we don't let our annoyance at a change of plans get in the way of seeing the new work that God is doing in and around us. Perhaps the miracle is seeing God carry you through and provide for you when you're stretched thin and out of your own resources. And so, I gave a silly little example about like losing a planning period as a teacher, but I feel like many people out there are going through real hardship. And I don't know, you've been inconvenienced by more than losing 30 minutes of planning, like your detour or your quote unquote inconvenience, whatever the Lord's bringing to your mind, is way more significant. And so I challenge you to pray about that, release it to the Lord, and see what he's trying to do in and through you through this inconvenient situation that you find yourself in. So I don't know. I don't know if that's out for somebody out there today to kind of challenge you with that. But we still have a lot of ground to cover. So let's get back to our original story. So we took a little detour of our own into the story of the feeding of the 5,000, but let's get back to the boat. So the disciples get in this boat. They've witnessed the miracle, but they didn't understand it. They didn't grasp it. And so now they're headed in the boat to Bethsaida without Jesus. Keep this location, that name Bethsaida, in your mind. We'll circle back to that toward the end. So the disciples travel on without Jesus, and Jesus goes to the mountainside to pray. What stands out to me here is that Jesus has been ministering, performing miracles, and engaging with crowds all day. And he also recently learned about the execution of his cousin and one of his dearest friends, John the Baptist, who he loved so dearly. So he must be exhausted, processing, grieving, yet in his times of greatest need and weariness and sorrow, he always turns to prayer. I find so often that when I'm weary or wiped out or worn down, the last thing I want to do is find the energy to pray. Yet I know from past experience and from what we see in the Bible that in those moments, even a simple prayer doesn't have to be long and flowery, just a simple, like proclaiming Jesus's name is the very thing my soul needs to begin to move toward rest and refreshment. So earlier the same day, we read in Mark 6:31, it says, "Then because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, 'Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest.'" So kind of circling back to this idea of like, Jesus is a rest giver, and the rest might end up looking a little different than you expected. But for the like striver or toiler out there, I wanted you to hear that reminder of Jesus as your giver of rest. And he gives permission and space to lie down in green pastures. I've taught about Psalm 23 many times now. And that's that beautiful reminder that he creates a place of peace and rest for the weary soul. So, if you're listening to this and I'm talking about like Jesus interrupting rest for a purpose, I also want you to find peace knowing like, yes, and Jesus also supports rest, and there is a time for that. And so, discerning like when something is a God-ordained interruption versus, or kind of leading you in a different way, versus when is your soul longing for rest. And Jesus says, yes, just rest in me. I've got this. I mean, he always says that, right? So I think the difference between the two is our attitudes. So the disciples felt like they were entitled to something and then they didn't get it. So they reacted with hardened hearts versus saying, okay, Lord, we'll get our rest. Right now, you want us to minister to these people, and then we'll trust you to provide for all of our needs. You'll get us fed. You'll get us rested. I release it to you. So I think there's a little difference there. I'm just processing it all out with you. So hopefully that made sense. And as I'm thinking about it even more, if we go back to the text, Mark 6 verse, where are we? 42, after he had divided up the fish for everyone to share, they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. So even though it didn't happen how they expected, Jesus still fed them. The disciples needed food and rest, and that's exactly what Jesus gave them. He fed the 5,000, and there were 12 baskets of food left over. Coincidentally, there are also 12 disciples, so maybe, there's something there. And so the Lord Jesus provided what they needed. And not just that, he provided an abundance of food, an abundance of leftovers. And, that speaks to my teacher heart because I sure love a leftover meal to be able to bring for lunch the next day. But they were too wrapped up in their own unmet expectations to realize that Jesus had just provided more than they could have ever asked or imagined. So before we move on back to our original story, I guess my question here would be, what provision of God are you missing out on recognizing in your life because it looks different than you expected? Is there an area where God is providing the very thing you need, but you don't recognize it because you wanted it a different way? So the next part of the story, going back to the disciples are in the boat. So they're in the boat. It's about 3 a.m. So they have been rowing for a long time and they are not getting very far. They're rowing hard against the wind and the waves. Verse 48 says that the wind was against them. The wording of that really struck out to me the first time I read it. I had underlined it many times. And I just feel like there are times in our lives where everything feels like it's against us. Even nature itself seems to be pushing us back. Does that sound relatable to anybody other than me? So this makes me think of a time, again, not a very serious example, but this picture of John and I went paddleboarding on a river, and we started out paddling against the current, and each stroke is a struggle. And if you even stop paddling for 1 second to take even one rest, all the progress you've made or that we had made was quickly destroyed because the current would just pull us right back to where we started. And I feel like that is how struggles in our lives can feel sometimes. Like I work and I strive and I'm pushing and pushing, and yet I don't feel like I'm making any progress. And if I stop for even a second, I feel like I just go back to where I started, and it can drive us crazy. You feel like, why can't I just catch a break? And if this is you, then I get it. And please stick with me because I do truly believe that God has some encouragement for you in this story. So back to it. Jesus sees the disciples struggling on the boat, and Jesus walks on the water with the intention of passing by the disciples. And that term there of passing by is the same term used when God passed by Moses on the mountain and Moses was changed. Just as God was revealing his glory to Moses, Jesus also intended to show the disciples his glory, thus leaving them changed, leaving them with a longing for and a deeper understanding of the power and presence of the Messiah. But the disciples didn't recognize Jesus. They thought Jesus was a ghost. They didn't recognize who he was. And their inaccurate view of Jesus led them to sitting in a place of fear, confusion, and uncertainty in the storm. The disciples saw Jesus walking on water, but they were still afraid, even though they had already witnessed Jesus calm a storm back in Mark 4. In this story, Jesus was sleeping in the boat and a storm blew in, beginning to fill the boat with water. The disciples were filled with fear and they wake Jesus up. And Mark 4:39 through 41 tells us Jesus' response. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." The wind ceased and there was a great calm. Then he said to them, the disciples, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked one another, "Who then is this? Even the wind and sea obey him." So they recognize that the wind and sea obey him in Mark 4, and yet they seem to have forgotten it by Mark 6. And I don't know exactly how much time passed between those two calming events or these two water events. But this command here that Jesus uses, silence, be still, this is the same Greek term that Jesus used as a command in Mark 1:25 to cast out an evil spirit. And I think this connection is an important reminder for us today that Jesus can calm the chaos and confusion going on around us, but also he can calm the chaos and confusion going on inside of us. All things in heaven, on earth, and under the earth are subject to his authority. They must listen and obey his command. So back to Mark 6. I warned you we'd be hopping around a lot today. I hope this is making sense. If it's a little too jumbled for you, please check out our show notes at collectedministries.org, also linked in the little podcast description down below on your app. But all these show notes lay it out, hopefully in a smooth flow if you're having a little bit of trouble following me today. It made sense mentally for me, but I'm not sure how it's translating now as I am teaching it back. But anyway, back to Mark 6. So what does Jesus do when he realizes that the disciples didn't recognize him? They thought he was a ghost. They missed his glory of him appearing to them, walking on the water. Does he keep walking, disappointed in his hard-hearted followers? Like, I'll show them they were going to get a miracle. Now they're just going to have to fight the storm on their own. No, he doesn't do that. Did he give up on them when their hearts immediately didn't change? No. Again, he didn't do that. Jesus stopped and stayed with them. He gets in the boat and his presence stays with them. The disciples were no longer enduring the wind and waves on their own. They had the presence of Jesus to calm their anxious hearts and give them a fresh perspective. And I feel like someone out there today needs a reminder that you are not on the waves all alone. Even though you feel tossed about in confusion or uncertainty, the presence of the Lord Most High is with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. And even though you are tossed on the waves, you will not go under and you do not have to face it alone. And just like with the disciples, Jesus is about the condition of our hearts today as well. Jesus may stop the wind and the waves, but this story reminds us that sometimes he doesn't right away too, right? Sometimes he stops them immediately. Sometimes they continue. But he's with us through it all, and he's kind, and he is present. He will show his glory, and he will get in the boat and stay with you. Jesus' main purpose is not always to change your circumstance, but to change your heart and to show you more of his heart. So when in this situation, though, when Jesus gets into the boat with the disciples, he does also calm the wind. And the wind is particularly particularly significant in this story because it not only shows the power of the Son of God, but it also changed the direction that the disciples were heading, which was just another act of God's power. So it all circles back to God's power. As we saw in the beginning of the story, the disciples originally set out to travel to Bethsaida, but at the end of the passage, we see that they landed in Gennesaret and they begin healing people there. So even more miraculous is a little detail that we get in John's version of this story in John 6:21, which just sneaks in there and says, "Then they were willing to take him on board, and at once the boat was at the shore where they were heading." So they didn't have to row anymore. The storm was calmed, and voila, they were at their destination. David Guzik in his commentary writes, Jesus rescued his disciples from working in futility. This was a miracle meant to assure them that he was in fact in control and that he would always lovingly be there to help them fulfill what he commanded. The disciples could stop fighting against the wind and suddenly arrive at their next destination, only to find that Jesus had a whole new destination in mind for them. So they didn't go to the place that they were originally heading. But before we get into these locations, that one other thing stood out to me. Sorry, I'm going back to that passage where it said, once they arrived, they began healing. So I wonder if this, like bringing Jesus onto the boat, because they had been in this place of like hangry, weary, hard-hearted, and yet something happened here when they recognize Jesus again and he calms the storm and he brings them safely to their destination. It's almost like he also refreshed and restored their souls because they're ready to dive into ministry again and they begin healing again. And so I think there's something there about like the presence of God when we recognize that he is near to us and we are not alone and we draw on his strength, then we get this revitalized energy, this new life to be able to hold course, like we talked about a few episodes ago, to hold course to our faith and to the work that God has given us to do. And so, you know, I'm stretching it here a little bit, but I think that is what happened with the disciples, where their hearts are softened and they have this renewed, refreshed passion or endurance for the ministry because, again, they hit the ground running again. No rest for the weary here. But I think after experiencing the presence of Jesus in this way, the weariness doesn't seem so bad. Maybe your physical body is tired, but your mind and heart are energized by the power of the risen Savior. I mean, that's some good power to have. Okay, so now I am all over in my notes. Here we go. We're going to focus and end today on these locations. So they were supposed to go to Bethsaida and they ended up in Gennesaret. So for some context here, we see Luke mention Bethsaida in Luke 10, verses 13 through 15. And Jesus is speaking, recorded by Luke, and Jesus says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida!" That doesn't sound good. "For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre or Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable in the judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will be exalted to heaven. You shall be brought down to Hades." Okay, so harsh words there for Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum, because they're remembered for their stubborn lack of faith. In contrast, Gennesaret means Garden of the Prince, Valley of Riches. It was also known as the Paradise of Galilee because of its fertility and beauty. And so it was in this place, this unplanned for diversion, that Jesus and his disciples were met with people with fertile hearts, ready and willing to accept Christ's healing and the gospel. And he brings them to the paradise of Galilee, this place of gardens. So yes, they're still doing ministry. They're still healing, but also I imagine they're in this beautiful paradise where they can have rest for their souls as well. So Jesus is like meeting the needs of the people in Gennesaret while he's also meeting the needs and the desire for rest of his disciples. Like he sees this big picture and he can be all things. He knows the unique needs of each person in the story, and he is willing and able to be there for all of them. And all of us, it's miraculous, and it blows my mind. So often in life, the storms that seem to come up out of nowhere will chart a new path for us. And this is what we see with the disciples here. And I want to end with this thought that God can use these storms to get you to the new place that he has for you. A place of open-hearted healing, restoration, and miracles. And a few times today, I've mentioned that word restoration, especially here as we wrap up. If you have not listened to my last episode on restoration, I break down where we see that word in the Bible and some different meanings of it, and do a real in-depth word study. I say in-depth, but I also am just barely scratching the surface on that one. But it's a good starting point. So if you haven't listened to that, I do encourage you to go back and listen if that is something your heart is longing for, some sort of restoration today. I also believe that today God is trying to move someone from Bethsaida, a place of stubborn lack of faith, to Gennesaret, a place of fertility and beauty and rest and promise. And God may be using a storm to change your direction, but even in the storm, Christ will never leave you, and he offers rest for your soul. So that is where I am leaving you today as we head into summer vacation for me as a teacher. I know a lot of you probably still work for this throughout the summer, and I'm very sorry for that. I don't know how people work all year. I'm spoiled in that sense. But as I leave you for a little sabbatical this summer, I encourage you to seek rest from the Lord, even in a storm. May these next couple months just be a time of healing, restoration, forward movement, trust in the Lord, no matter what your circumstance is, that you recognize that he is near to you. He never leaves you. His presence never leaves. And so you can draw on him for strength, for peace, for a calm spirit, for security, whatever it is that you are praying for and seeking, he has it for you. So just rest in him, and I will be back. I don't have an exact date yet, but I will announce it once I have some guests booked. I'm imagining we'll be back in early August, but if I get some really exciting guests that are available in July, like I did last year, I'll probably just kick off season 9 early. I'm always looking forward to a break, and then I get on a break and I'm just itching to start back up again. So thank you for being with me today, and I will be praying for you this summer. If there's anything specific, I would love to pray for you by name. So email me anytime at jess@collectedministries.org, or send me a message on Instagram at Collected Podcast. All that's linked below in the show notes. So I hope you have a wonderful week, a wonderful summer filled with rest and recognizing the goodness of God, no matter what circumstance you may find yourself in. So until next time, I hope you have enjoyed the Collected Podcast, and we'll see you in the fall. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Collected Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. And if you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you'd help spread the word. Check back here for new episodes dropping every other Thursday. You can follow along on social media at Collected Ministries.